Thank you, and thank you to Celia for a really wonderful and moving talk there. It's that sort of story that got me interested in Clementine Churchill. I hadn't really been a Churchillian before, but she's brought me into the family. I do think she is the most... I'm hoping this will work. There we go. This is one of the first pictures I saw of her, and I just couldn't help feeling that it denoted a wonderful partnership of equals. I think she's sort of, looking him in the eye, there was this real tenderness there and intimacy, but also a real kind of partnership. And it was that kind of feeling that got me interested. And the more I found out about her, the more inspiring and an interesting woman she was. And I feel, I see that the session is called Remembering Clementine Churchill. I don't think she's remembered enough, actually, and I'm hoping that my book will do a small part in reversing that. It was interesting, obviously, near here at Blenheim was where Winston Churchill and Clementine Hozier became engaged in August 1908. And you can visit the little temple to Diana where they took shelter from a rain shower. And try to imagine yourself in her shoes. She was 23 years old. She was shy. She was a little insecure. She was wearing her last clean dress. She was an aristocrat, obviously, but she wasn't born into great wealth, far from it. And she'd been summoned to Blenheim Palace, this great forbidding place, and she knew why she'd been invited, and I'm sure she was extraordinarily excited about it, but she was also in an agony of suspense. She was supposed to have gone walking with Winston that morning, and he'd overslept. And so the walk had been postponed, and there he was, this sort of rising politician, global celebrity already, 11 years older than her. It was thrilling, but she was having to wait, and they went for this long walk, and he was still not saying anything, and it was hot and sticky, and she began to think that her pride was at stake, and so there they were in this temple, and still he wasn't popping the question, and she saw a spider on the floor, and she decided if the spider reached the crack in the paving stones before he said anything, then she would leave. Well, fortunately for all of us, that spider was quite slow, and Winston was a little quicker, and, the rest is history, as they say. And so, indeed, began one of the greatest and perhaps least understood political partnerships in history. And I say political partnerships, obviously this was a great love match, an emotional match as well. They did, I'm sure, really, really love each other, but there was also a great political core to that relationship. And that's partly what I also explore in this book. And yet her face, his face, obviously, his profile, hugely well known anywhere in the world, her face, I would venture to you, is much less well known. And when I started writing this book, often people said to me, oh, she's the American one, isn't she? And I said, no, that was his mother. And I did a Woman's Hour. Some of you may know that programme on the BBC Radio 4 10 days ago or so. And a very nice researcher phoned me up, young, well-educated, intelligent, and she said to me, do you know, before I heard about your book, I didn't even know Winston Churchill was married. She was... so again, I'm hoping to, make sure that that's no longer the case. Because as Celia so rightly pointed out, I think that Winston Churchill himself would have been very different without her. And it's not just Celia, obviously, who thought that. Pug Ismay also said the history of Winston Churchill in the world could well have been very different without her. And Gil Wynant, who was the American ambassador during the war, also said that she's done extraordinary things for her country and that maybe one day she would get her credit that she was due. Mary Soames, of course, her daughter, wrote a brilliant book about her, but that first came out 35 years ago now. What I'm trying to do is introduce her to a new generation, such as the BBC researcher who phoned me up, and I did a talk at Blenheim a couple of days ago, and I was really pleased at the end of it. A number of young women, probably university age, came up to me and said, I knew nothing about her, and she sounds so inspiring. I really want to find out more, and this really hugely pleased me, I must say. It is also instructive to compare her fame, or comparative lack of it, with her direct contemporary Eleanor Roosevelt. And I spent some time while I was writing the book over in the States, researching the relationship, their meetings, their letters, this hasn't really been looked into before. And it's interesting, I've just recently received words that Hillary Clinton apparently wants to see a copy of the book, because she's a great sort of fan of Eleanor Roosevelt, and this was a side of Eleanor Roosevelt that she hadn't really been aware of before. There they were, during the war, married to the two men, Churchill and FDR, tasked with saving the world from Hitler. This was an extraordinary role, obviously, for both of them. And so what did they contribute? How involved were they? How did they get on? And did they learn from each other? Diplomacy during the Second World War was incredibly personal. I think we've all sort of come to realise that. So that these emotions were important as to how things went. And I think it's fair to say that neither man was particularly keen on the other's wife. And perhaps both women had certain issues with the other's husband as well. Eleanor was not Churchill's type. I think it was Mary Soames who sort of put this rather sort of succinctly. I think he thought her a sort of unappealing mix of forthright opinion and earnest disapproval. And he also noticed that she was frequently absent at the height of war. Again, Celia was saying how important Clementine's support was, and she was away in Russia during VE Day, but for most of the war, there she was by his side, taking care of him and taking care of the problems that arose constantly. And I think Churchill also noticed that she was not, this is Eleanor Roosevelt, not particularly bothered by dress or decor. Clementine always absolutely immaculate, and her food, even during the war with rationing, the food that was served at her table, ambrosial, someone described it, whereas Roosevelt said the food in the Roosevelt White House would do justice to the automat. So there we have Roosevelt having to put up with this dreadful sounding salad, which was canned pineapple, radishes, and a lot of mayonnaise, which apparently was the Roosevelt salad. Whereas Clementine's food was absolutely wonderful and ambrosial indeed. Eleanor thought Churchill, we know this from some letters and comments she made to her daughter Anna, well, he had this reputation of being a drunken warmonger. That obviously wasn't the case, but Eleanor sometimes sort of bought into that kind of myth, and she was very worried that Winston kept Roosevelt up too late and drinking, and she was a near teetotaler herself. Her own family had problems with alcoholism, so she was always worried about this, and I think the White House staff gave Churchill rather a reputation of being a big drinker, whereas I think those glasses of whiskey by his side actually lasted for a very long time, and perhaps they didn't quite realise that. Equally, Clementine thought President Roosevelt rather vain, and they met in Quebec at one of the conferences there, and he made this terrible mistake on their first meeting of calling her Clemmy, and that was something that you had to earn. It was a privilege you had to earn after many sort of years of devoted friendship. And Mary Soames again sort of, I think, found it quite amusing, but also noted that her mother didn't find it amusing. And she was always slightly worried, slightly protective, I think, of Winston not being too sort of emotionally transparent, perhaps, with the president. But equally, she also intervened when she thought that Churchill might alienate the president altogether. And one of the examples of that was around Christmas 1944 over Greece, where the Americans thought that Churchill was taking a more pro-monarchist view than they were comfortable with, and there was a bit of a spat, I think it's fair to say. And Clementine, at one point, did intervene quite sort of urgently and say, please don't repeat what you said to me this morning to anyone until you've spoken to me again. She understood the importance, obviously, of being on side with the Americans, not only for the war, of course, but for the peace thereafter. I think it's fair to say also that FDR initially was probably rather starstruck by Churchill. When they met, Churchill was already this global legend, and that he later, as he became more frail, perhaps began to tire of the late night talking and drinking. And at the second Quebec conference, it's notable that Clementine would take Churchill off to bed about 10:30, so he wouldn't be tempted to keep the president up. And Churchill apparently said at one point, "Aren't I a good boy?" as he was taken off, and FDR was saved from that. the president was a very different man from Churchill. Churchill was very much a one-woman man all his life. Clemmy was his great love. The president and Eleanor Roosevelt, Churchill was right, Eleanor Roosevelt was often not around during the war, and he sought unquestioning female adoration. This wasn't something that Eleanor perhaps provided, or not in the way that he wanted it. And it's also true that in April 1945, when he died, there were 4 women with him, and not one of them was his wife. They were very different. So there were lots of cross-currents. I think it's interesting, and it's important to remember that these were people, these are legends, but when you read their letters and you read the diaries of people there at the time, there were also people with emotions who felt things. And I think it's important to remember that, and that there were all these cross-currents going on between these two people. But it's also noticeable, this was a great political partnership, but at times, Eleanor Roosevelt and Clementine did things. They brought American Britain back together, or closer together again, when there were other tensions going on. And I think it's also important to remember that. I think they became friendly, although perhaps not great friends. And I think there's evidence, when you look at the letters and what happened after they met, that they inspired each other. Although initially, when you look at them, they have very little in common. They looked very different. Clementine, always beautiful, always immaculate. Here they're making a joint broadcast in Quebec. Eleanor, slightly plain, a little windswept, not quite so elegant, that she's actually spruced up very nicely here, but she was never known for her fashion sense. In fact, when she came over to Britain in 1942, one of the things that people liked about her was that they thought that some of her clothes had been made over. And they thought, wow, the First Lady of America does that. I mean, I don't think anyone would have thought that about Clementine. There was always a sort of glamour and elegance about her. Eleanor, initially, much more outward-going, informal, chatty, obviously much more independent of her husband. There was once a headline on the American papers saying, this is actually a headline saying, Mrs. Roosevelt stays the night at White House. It was so rare that she would ever be at home. Clementine was there. Obviously, she went to Russia, as Celia said, but she was there so often helping her husband. But she was much more retiring, particularly perhaps in the beginning of the war. She was much more in his shadow. The fact is, she was doing an enormous amount to support him in every way, but it was much more behind closed doors. And consequently, she really hasn't perhaps received the applause that she deserves. However, they soon discovered that they had much in common, not least the fact that marriage and the war had thrown this similar role into both of them. They were a similar age, similar aristocratic background. They did share a concern for the poor, a dislike of gambling and extravagance that probably came from their childhoods. That was slightly sort of alien to their husbands. And as a consequence, some rather unkind critics thought that they were sort of crashing bores because they both were quite moralistic women. But I think totally unfair in both counts. I think Clementine had the most wonderful laugh, apparently, and Eleanor, too, was great fun to be with. Both had been schooled in England. Eleanor Roosevelt at Answood Academy. She came here after the death of her parents. And each had been taken in hand by an inspirational headmistress. Clementine went to a grammar school in Berkhamsted where Miss Beatrice Harris realised that she had a remarkable pupil on her hands and tried to persuade her to go to university. Her mother had rather different ideas. They had both had rather difficult and fearful childhoods, and they'd both been considered plain when young. Eleanor's mother used to call her granny. Both had lost an infant child, and both were married to men who were extremely, well, one might say, even egotistical men, self-absorbed, certainly, and unwilling to discipline their children. They rather left that to their wives with various consequences. Both had sort of feelings that they were inadequate as mothers, and both had been prone to depression, in part perhaps because of the enormous burden of being married to such men. I think you can also say that both men were also the keepers of their husbands' consciences. Clementine constantly sort of telling Winston of what people were saying when she went on her tours of air raid shelters, what were people writing to her in her huge mailbag. Both were very brave women and stoic. They endured a great deal in their lives with great sort of dignity. And there were occasions when they did sort of try and shore up the Anglo-American alliance when there were tensions. They wrote to each other, and there was one letter I think of particularly after one of the Quebec conferences where things hadn't gone quite according to plan. And Clementine wrote Eleanor this letter, absolutely gushing, saying how wonderful it had been to stay with her, how wonderful the president was, how she wished that he would have great political success in the future, and also how, although she'd only met Anna, their daughter, very, very briefly, how Anna represented the boast of both parents and was so wonderful. Dare she say it, she wanted to send her love and loved her already. This was diplomacy at the highest level. This was a very sort of targeted letter, I believe. She knew sometimes that she had to help things, run along when there were other problems. They also make joint broadcasts together. This one here, as you can see, Eleanor usually was the one who pushed Clementine into doing this. She was much more used to being a public person. In fact, Clementine felt at one point that she was rather hounded into doing this broadcast. She'd had a very sort of big lunch with lots of people and lots of wine and lots of courses, and she really didn't want to do this, and she even had to make a little speech after the lunch, and she hid behind a potted palm at one point thinking, oh, maybe I'll get out of it that way, but there was no escape. And later on they made this rather wonderful broadcast together in English and French. Actually, they both spoke fluent French as well. That's something else that they shared, and Clementine performed very well. The first time they met was when Eleanor Roosevelt came to Britain in October 1942, and she came here to find out more about women's experience of the war and to visit American troops stationed over here. She was on her own. FDR was busy with the war, and obviously it wasn't so easy for him to travel anyway. But he had, in effect, sent his wife on this challenging, difficult, dangerous, but exciting trip as a sort of sop to her, to smooth her feelings. She did feel excluded from what was going on in the White House. She'd been so close to him politically before the war, during the New Deal years, but that closeness was now disintegrating, in effect. And she had therefore sort of gone on to do her own thing. She held her own press conferences. She conducted her own visits. She wrote her own daily newspaper column. She was on occasion even referred to half-jokingly as Madam President. She had been very useful as her husband's eyes and ears, and was had this wonderful, wholesome image that often gave her higher ratings than her husband. But when his attention turned from welfare to weapons, she was shut out, and she wrote to Anna saying that she felt she should leave the decisions to the important people, as she called them. And in fact, there are suggestions that the only way she found out about Pearl Harbor that night in America entering the war was by the frantic traffic in and out of her husband's office. I think she did feel quite shut out. By contrast, Clementine knew all the major decisions of the war. Sarah wrote to her after the war saying, how extraordinary it must be from being someone who knew about everything now, being cast out of power, how different that must be. We even know that she knew about the ultra decrets from Bletchley Park. One of the letters refers to the golden eggs, which was the information that they got from those decrets. So she knew quite a lot more than a lot of the cabinet. But Churchill was struck by Roosevelt's secretiveness with Eleanor Roosevelt and rose the subject over drinks at the White House one evening. And he said, I tell Clemmy everything. And the president replied, well, that was all wonderful, but he couldn't tell Eleanor everything because she might put it in her newspaper column by mistake the next day. So this greatest of great first ladies, I think, was really quite frustrated by her reduced role during the Second World War. And I think you can really contrast that with Clementine, who was very much by her husband's side. However, when she came to Britain in 1942, Eleanor was treated as an A-list celebrity. So she received standing ovations in Oxford, Cambridge, Bristol, Birmingham, Manchester, Liverpool, Glasgow, Belfast and Edinburgh. And in London, much like if George Clooney turned up, I guess, people loitered around the American embassy just to get a glimpse of her. So she wasn't a silent shadow to her husband. And this was a very sort of different way of using her fame and her position and her popularity to aid others, support worthy causes, raise morale, whatever it was. She may have lost ground in the White House itself, but she knew very, very well how to exude a very personal, informal style. She'd run up steps to meet people. She'd be really enthusiastic. It really inspired people. People loved it. And there was Clementine, the rather sort of shy person, gradually coming out of her shell more and more, but she was watching and learning from this. And apparently, she even sort of noticed how Eleanor Roosevelt called her secretary by her first name. I think in Churchill circles before then it was always Miss this and Miss that. And one of the accounts said that after she met Mrs. Roosevelt, she began to call Miss Hamlin Grace. Anyway, so Clementine was dazzled by Eleanor Roosevelt, and she wrote to FDR about the effect his wife's presence was having on our women and girls. When she appears, their faces light up with gladness and welcome. There's a bit of diplomacy going on here, obviously, as well. She also paid tribute to Eleanor's handling of the press. I was struck by the ease, friendliness, and dignity with which she talked with the reporters, and by the esteem and affection with which they evidently regard her. So she saw how a woman could establish herself as a public figure in her own right, and perhaps just what she might be able to do if she followed suit. I think all the fundraising she did for the Aid to Russia Fund, which again Celia mentioned and talked about so poignantly just now, she did push herself forward more and more as she raised money for that fund, which was a staggering achievement, by the way, when you think that how bankrupt Britain was. To raise all that money was really quite incredible. Eleanor wrote in her diary that she found Clementine attractive, youthful and charming, but rather constrained, she thought, by her husband's notion that women should remain in the background. And so she was rather difficult to get to know. This is her diary. She has had to assume a role because of being in public life. The role is now part of her, but one wonders what she's like underneath. I think they did enjoy each other's company, though, and I think there was a bond. And they did keep in touch after the war to some extent as well. And I think perhaps that bond grew a little stronger after a rather poignant trip to Canterbury when Eleanor was here, where they met. Great crowds of excited women and children surged forward to meet them both. It was just a wonderful day. And the next day, the Germans bombed Canterbury by daylight. And they felt that perhaps some of those women and children had been killed. Eleanor was incredibly shaken by this, and she wrote to FDR that the spirit of the English people is something to bow down to. It was a really sort of truly sobering moment for her, and I think sort of made her realise what Britain had been through. There was the odd glimpse of female solidarity during that trip. Or was it female solidarity, or was it Clementine playing an extraordinary diplomatic role again? There was a small dinner party in Downing Street held in Eleanor Roosevelt's honour, and the subject of the Spanish Civil War came up. And Eleanor Roosevelt sort of mentioned or pushed Churchill on why more wasn't done to help the Republicans. And he was, I think, rather astonished that a woman was pressing him in this way in public, and was rather furious and stood up for the table, signalled that dinner was to leave. And Clementine leant forward and said, I think perhaps Mrs. Roosevelt is right. Now, was that female solidarity? Was she actually perhaps almost welcoming someone challenging her husband? Most people didn't. They were too scared to. Or was it simply that she saw that this was potentially going to be a little bit of a problem, a little bit of a disagreement, and that she needed to smooth the feathers? Either way, it was an extraordinary move on her part. Yeah. Yeah. After this visit, actually, I love this picture. It's probably my favourite picture of her. She was always, as I say, immaculate and well-dressed in the war, with a turban, which denoted her solidarity with munitions workers who had to wear turbans to keep their hair out of machinery and away from dangerous chemicals. And this was Clementine as she sort of began to relax into her role of First Lady. This is where on a factory visit she's dancing with someone. This sort of thing would go down hugely well, and she became incredibly popular in her own right. Here, she's with Winston and they're chatting with someone in a factory. And it's notable that in 1944, when the US Treasury Secretary, Henry Morgenthau, came to Britain, he wanted to go around the air raid shelters. And no one could think of, this is at the point when Churchill's popularity was declining, people were frustrated the war was still going on, there were sort of protests against him, and no one could think of anyone in the government who could take Mr. Morgenthau around the air raid shelters without any threat of protest. And then finally someone came up with the idea of Clementine doing it, and she really impressed Mr. Morgenthau. He watched her chatting so nicely with everyone there. They all loved it. He saw what a morale booster she was. And he wrote, "The dame is unbelievable." And remember, this is a man whose wife, Eleanor, was Eleanor Roosevelt's best friend. "The dame is unbelievable. She is just like Mrs. Roosevelt." So it's interesting that, you know, one likes to speculate just what they influenced in each other. The other thing that happened was at the end of Eleanor Roosevelt's trip, she went back to America. She always had a frantic schedule. Perhaps the only time ever she cleared an hour and a half in her frantic schedule. And perhaps remembering how immaculate and wonderful Clementine always was, she asked for her hair and her nails to be done. And that was perhaps the only time that she had that in her schedule. So these were two women who learned a lot from each other. But ultimately, I think the political partnership that was really extraordinary during the war years was that between Winston and Clementine. And it is incredibly sort of fascinating to look at today and to thank them both and to be so grateful that that partnership happened and that he did pop the question finally at Blenheim. Thanks very much indeed.